Okay. So I'm not seeing Catherine. I'm not. She'll join when she has a chance, and I'm not seeing anyone other attending. So there's not going to be privilege of the floor. And Jonathan, you probably got the email from Will about the age-friendly workshop. I don't know if you had a chance to read email this afternoon, but on April 20th, we'll be presenting at a workshop. It's workshop number 3 on age-friendly stuff. And you said what this one's called, rural advocacy, Will?
Advocacy, yep.
Yeah, okay. And
I'm doubtful that I'll be able to make it. I actually went to the website and was looking at it. It looks interesting. And then I realized that Tuesday, we're cooking a turkey, and we are going to have the first in-person dinner party that we've had in over a year. All people that have been fully vaccinated and stuff. But I think I'm going to be busy stuffing a turkey that morning and not really available to go online.
Okay, interesting. Will, for my benefit, you said Dr. Warner students are presenting some stuff. What are they doing? What have they been looking at, and who's Dr. Warner?
So Mildred Warner is in planning at Cornell, and her students looked at comprehensive plans for several towns in Tompkins County and compared them. And a lot of what they have to say is actually about Caroline's plan.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for the heads up on all that. Okay. I think we'll get started on then some battery storage stuff. So Will, you've been diving deep into codes, and I sent around the answer you got from the one guy at New York State. So I'm on agenda item 2, status of information gathering. Is there more information you are thinking you need to gather in terms of reaching out either to state officials or elsewhere? Do you think you kind of have the pieces and it's a question of sort of dealing with it? Or are you feeling lost, needing more information, or are you feeling like you got the information you need
now? I think I mostly have it, but I still find some of the jurisdictional issues confusing. So, I'm still on that learning curve.
Could I ask, this is sort of jumping back a bit, but do we have any model laws or example laws from any other towns for a battery siting rules? Like you did for the
I don't.
solar?
Will, did you come across anything yet, or try? I mean, I can ask.
Like with the solar law, NYSERDA put out their recommendations, and it seems that the fire code people do have some enthusiasm for NYSERDA, and that they did work together quite a bit.
So that, because you did pull, I remember you seeing that model law. It had a battery energy storage like model permit or something, right? But was there also a model law? I'm sort of coming back to me vaguely. And did it cover all size systems, that model law?
Mostly they just made a cutoff at 600 kilowatt hours. But honestly, the way the fire code works is more like what you were suggesting before, which is, they're like buildings. So when you read through the fire code, a lot of the restrictions are based on what kind of housing you're going to put them in, rather than the other way around. It's it feels backwards, but it's just because of the way they look at it. They're protecting buildings, and we're trying to tell you what kind of building you need.
Right. So John, I think the answer is, yeah, we have just this one, which is sort of like a model law put out by NYSERDA. And I don't know that we don't have anything that other communities have done. I don't know if any have, and that would be something I think we could, let me talk to Mark about that. It might be something that the town lawyer can look into, or, you know, that there's a way, the Association of Towns basically would be, Mark could reach out to the Association of Towns and see if the people there know of any other laws. So that's a great idea.
Will has clearly done a lot of the homework that needs to be done already. So
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily saying we desperately need one or anything, but I'd be interested in reading one if there was sort of an intact, completed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, they may have really good lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice. So, right, and I admit, you know, I've read through and probably need to read through at least twice. I've read through and probably need to read through about 5 times to begin to really comprehend this, is because there's a lot of stuff and dense and all that. So I still feel lost even having read all the things that you pulled together. But I really appreciate the document in which you sort of said, here's sort of what's covered, here's what's not covered here, and looking specifically at some of the things we had in the law. I think that's really helpful to sort of see where we need to finish dotting I's and crossing T's or whatever. As you sort of, you and I have talked, and Jonathan, probably you've been part of this too at some meeting, I probably mentioned, you know, there's been an interim debate in my mind. Do we just try to modify our site plan review law to cover battery facilities? Do we create a whole new law like we're starting to do, we did for the solar, or how do we move forward on this? And as Will has said, you know, often they're kind of like buildings, but as I think you point out, Will, too, they could be a field of container structures, right? They conceivably, in terms of what a battery facility is. So in terms of what we write or don't write, I mean, I do get the sense that a lot of from the fire end, there's an awful lot in the code. And I don't know if that means we simply say, I mean, anything has to comply with that fire code, right? It's not like you have to write a law that says comply with that fire code.
Yep.
Will, since you're the one who's looking at this most, how are you feeling about whether how much we need to maybe write anew versus like a whole standalone law versus, oh, if we do these few things, add them to our site plan law and then rely on the existing fire code, that will be okay? Do you have an opinion on that yet?
There's a couple issues that I'm still a little stuck on. One of them is the fire codes have a concept that out here in the rural areas, there's less risk. And that's just, I would say that's only true if you make lots of assumptions about how fast that fire gets put out and how much the destroyed property is worth. But the fire code people themselves are actually very open to hearing from rural people. We can go and complain to them. They're available. And you know that presentation you passed to me, Bill, at one point, the guy was saying, oh, you just throw a lot of water on it, lots of water. And, you know, and you just sort of sitting there going, well, this guy lives in the city.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's where it gets tricky, is that none of us are firemen, but you start to get the feeling that they've made these assumptions that don't fit very well. So I would have concerns about the communications requirements. They talk about monitoring. I was happy to see that for some instances they require continual monitoring. And it's really good that they have requirements for all kinds of backup, so that if there's a fire or a loss of grid power for their systems, for their monitoring systems, there's a backup system that should hopefully be sufficient to close down their internal systems. It's really tricky. I think the bottom line is that if anything catches on fire, either from like a chemical reaction or heat, or from a grass fire nearby, they're just going to let it burn. One thing the folks at Slaterville Fire Department brought up that is, sorry, the phone is separate here. One of the things, I have to wait for Jonathan to get the phone, it's for him. And it's tax season, this tax person. So one of the things they brought up that I never thought of and is not anywhere in this is if you have something located in a field and it catches on fire, they're not going to drag their engines across the field. They can't because of the risk of the engines getting stuck in the field because they're such heavy vehicles. And of course, we don't build our fields. So what happens is these talk about access a little bit, but if you only have one way in and the fire is blocking that way in and you didn't require them to build alternate access, the fire's just going to burn because nobody can get into the field from an alternate access point.
Right. So are you saying, so sometimes they will just simply have to let the fire burn, but that's not the preferred thing to have happen? Okay. When you said there's a requirement for continual monitoring.
They will let a fire.
Go ahead, Will.
They'll let a fire burn before they'll put a fireman at risk of electrocution or let a fire truck be stuck where they can't get out because, then they lose something really expensive. And then they shared with me, they agreed the water situation is just problematic.
Right, by that you
it's
mean
already problematic, as you know.
Right. So, Catherine and Jonathan, I think this was something Will and I were talking about, and came up at also one of our workshops, that the fire stations already have issues sometimes getting enough water to put out a fire, and they want some dry hydrants or things in the town to help alleviate that. And that's a problem, say, if there's a battery energy storage facility and suddenly they have to put it out. There's sort of an assumption in the fire code that there's water available because, like, you're in a town with a fire hydrant nearby, and then out here that isn't necessarily the case. And so do we have to do something different, like mandate that they have a water supply, adjacent, or what? So I think that is indeed a important question. Backing up, Will, you said that there's a requirement for continual monitoring in, I guess, the fire code. You mean something like smoke detectors, heat detectors, going into a central system or something like that?
Yeah, gas, off-gassing detection, that's another thing. The continual monitoring, though, I think was pretty specific to one of those, and not to all of them. There's monitoring for all of them that's required because they recognize that batteries often give off heat, and they don't want to wait for the smoke. They want to see the heat rise. So they want to monitor the heat rise.
Okay, so they have various early warning systems in place. So Catherine, the background of this here is, okay, so what's already there in code, like fire code, so we don't have to worry about it, right? So they have to do that anyway. So that's why Will's been taking this deep dive into the state codes to figure out and make our life easier. And then the bottom line question is, okay, are we simply proposing a few amendments to the site plan review law, or are we writing a law that covers battery energy storage systems similar to how we wrote a law for the solar energy stuff? And I think that's sort of the central question the committee probably needs to decide tonight if we have enough data. So that's probably why Will was gathering all this data, is so to see, okay, is it like, oh, there's just a few extra things we have to cover because everything else is already covered by code.
So what's really weird is that when you have fire codes that are dependent on what kind of building classification you're looking at, so residential, and then there's single family, and then there's multiple family, and then large apartment buildings or offices. There's a specific classification for electric generating stations. And then additional to that, some of the battery storage systems, even if they're functioning as electric generating stations, do not fall into that category. So when you're working with this, you really have to know what kind of building your classification you fall into. It's not just what kind of building, but what kind of building classification does that building fall into? So where we thought it would just fall under, I thought originally, well, it's hazardous, obviously, but it doesn't fall under any of the hazardous, any of the categories, like they're called H1, H2, H3, H4. It doesn't fall under any of that.
Yeah, so by definition, so by definition, there are different classifications, but even might be two different classifications depending on whether they're a generating station or not a generating station. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I reposed the question based on everything you've learned now. Do you now have an opinion on whether we should try to write a separate law or try to get this slid inside the site plan review law as it's going to be reviewed and modified in the next few months, probably?
I think that you would want to maybe look at what some of those pieces are where the town does get to have a say, and then when you've looked at those, decide whether to slide them in or make them their own. So, like, for instance, the access, what I was just describing about the access, I think you want to decide whether that's, one of those, well, too bad situations, or if you want to tackle it. And there were a few other places where the authority having jurisdiction could make decisions, including on decommissioning. And I really like what we did with the decommissioning and restoration for solar, and I don't see the same thing for buildings, maybe for obvious reasons, but.
Yeah, so, right, so that's a question, because you would raise that also, because when you talk about decommissioning, it's one thing to say, pull all the solar panels out of the field, but if someone has built, for certain they're going to have like a cement slab on which they're putting all these heavy batteries, et cetera. What does decommissioning that mean? I mean, they're going to really tear all that out or not. I don't know. Oh, Leo's joining us. Okay.
Well, you don't want to end up with an EPA site, right? I mean, an EPA cleanup site
Right.
paid for by the town.
Yes. So, okay. So it looks like decommissioning might need some, special attention, and therefore have a phrase in a law, because that's not, that would be so particular. I didn't think that would necessarily go into site plan review, because you're not going to ask any commercial structure to be. Now there is a proposal in the amendments to the site plan review law that there be an escrow fund could be required, so that the building could be torn down at least if no one took over the commercial space. It's not quite the same as decommissioning when you've got something like a battery storage facility. But at any rate, so sort of that, but decommissioning is a bit more involved when you're talking about the fact that you have all these batteries and other things around, I guess.
Yes.
All right, so sounds like it's still sort of, we need to look hard at some of the details is what I hear you saying. Anybody else have questions for Will right now? I know you guys all got the material really late. I've had a busy week and I didn't get that out earlier, sorry.
Will, did I understand correctly that if there's only one access road, like it's up on a hilltop, there's only the one access road, the fire trucks won't go up there?
I think what Will was saying is that if the fire happens to cut off that one road, they're basically stuck because
Yeah,
they can't go off
why
road.
they would. I just want to make sure that, because I would think that would be something that we wouldn't want to allow, that we should insist on that not being the case, because otherwise it's creating a plethora of possible dangerous situations, the firemen going in when they really shouldn't, but they, don't want to just stand back and let the thing burn, spreading to other buildings because it's not being dealt with if there's other structures around.
Right, so the requirement
Maybe that would be a requirement for anything over a certain size that we really think is merits it.
Okay. I think that's a good suggestion. Will, something you had
So
brought
one
up.
of the things that that I'm still on the learning curve about are operating permits, because I think you told us that our town doesn't really issue operating permits. So I sort of get that, but I see that in the fire code, there's references to operating permits. So I don't know if that's something worth looking further into. And here's the one reason you might consider it, or maybe pick it up a different way. If you have something happen during operation where there's some kind of event with the release of gas or chemicals, something like that, I guess it's not spelled out who's responsible, who has to get to the site first and make the call on what happens next. So for some types of facilities, the operating people are responsible to arrive or be there when there's an event, and then they coordinate what happens next. And now it gets beyond what I could take in and remember, but there's a difference on the order of events for how emergency responders come in, depending on who's in charge.
Okay. Yeah, what you're saying is
And that
making me,
could be related to size. Sorry.
no worries. I mean, 'cause what you're saying, for example, if there's a chemical spill, I would think that DEC would be an agency that would get involved. If it's a fire, then it's the local fire companies, right? So someone's got to make that call is, oh, we got to go, who gets involved and who's got to go. And so, and I don't know who does that. I mean, did
No,
fire people?
it could even be a difference for a fire. It's not always the same people responsible from minute one, once a fire is detected. And especially if it's a commercial operation, you know, when we're, you know, Jane Public and, oh no, my house is on fire. Obviously I step back and say, okay, go do whatever. But when it's a commercial operation, it's not the same. And the responsibilities, I guess, are different for some types of operations, who gets to direct it. This could better be explained by a fire person.
Okay. Go ahead, Catherine.
I guess I want to advocate for zooming out on this a bit. I am, you know, I defer to you all who've done like this unbelievable work, and Will, the deep dive is, you know, really not kind of impressive, very impressive. I am finding myself, even as a you know, a board member, confused about what we're doing here. So I guess I would just encourage some zooming out.
Okay. And I agree that that's why I said the basic question, the zoom out question is, okay, where are we going with this? Are we writing a law? Are we writing amendments to this, to the, you know, site plan review law? And I think the difficulty is sort of understanding which of those might work. Unfortunately, requires understanding what some of the issues are. But I, you know, so I want to keep it on that level of, okay, which way we're going to go. So that my next question to Will was, okay, what are the other niggling problems or issues or concerns? Like, you know, you brought the issue about the access roads, and one decision be, okay, therefore we as the local municipality might want to make a requirement that there be separate, you know, an alternate access road. Are there other questions like that that you want to pose to Catherine and Jonathan, myself, of, geez, I'm wondering if this is a problem or an issue or not? That's one possible zoom out thing. It's still going to be little tiny things to some extent, but because I too, like I say, I've been talking to you a lot more about it, and my eyes glaze over when I read through this stuff. It's just really hard. And I want to figure out a way for us to make progress.
Okay, well, one of the things is the fire code officer gets to approve a lot of things, even if they're not spelled out in detail. So I'm left wondering, to what extent does the town direct a fire code official? You know, the fire code officer.
So they came. So I don't know, Catherine, if you have any insight. I mean,
I don't
for
think
us,
really at all.
yeah, right. I mean, is there a fire code official, or is that just our code officer? I think you asked that question once before, Will. I think, yeah. So it's our code officer.
Yep.
You know, I think we just have to bear in mind, like, that this body is the planning board. You know, you're raising a lot of other agencies and officials who would have jurisdiction over like a project, but that's not really in the purview of planning.
Well, except the code officer is the person approving the construction. Right? So for like the code officer and the code official, sometimes they're not the same. Fire code officials sometimes different, but they are the ones who approve the construction if you're just following the code. If there's no review board involved, then it's that person then it would be our code officer in his role as the fire code official approving a design.
Right. So I think the way to look at this is, if there were nothing, if someone were building a battery storage facility that disturbed less than 1 acre, which meant there would be no review board role, all decisions would be made by our code officer. I think that's what I'm hearing from you, Will, correct? And that is the way it is. I mean, just the way it is.
Yep.
I mean, we're not.
That's the way it is for a house. That's the way it is
Yes.
for,
Right.
talk about access roads. I mean, there are plenty of houses that don't have access roads that would be considered,
Right.
safe, and that's not, that's how it is.
Except that I think the difference here is that potentially the hazards of a bunch
Right.
of batteries going fire are higher to
Right.
noxious fume releases, whatever. So there may be reasons for the town to step in for the public safety and welfare to
Right.
say, no, you have to have 2 access roads. I mean, because like our house, nightmare, right? We hope there is never, ever a fire here because we actually
Right.
think a fire truck probably can't get to our house.
Right. Exactly.
But that's okay. We take that risk because a fire here is not going to affect anybody else probably. Right. So the question is, or one could say, we don't care how much land you disturb. The review board is going to review every battery energy storage facility. I think it's, above some minimum kilowatt hour size. I think that's probably where we're going, but that could just be a line in the site plan review law saying they're going to review it so that we don't have just the code officer trying to make those sort of determinations.
Right. I mean, it just seems like with any project or any, there are particular health and safety concerns with a number of different projects, right? Like if you had a
Right.
CAFO, you'd have all sorts of concerns about, manure storage and all sorts of things. I don't know that you need to, I mean, I question, I'm not saying I know, but I would offer curiosity around whether this is something that needs to be written into the law or, the appropriate authorities for each designated hazard would then step in and decide what needs to be done.
Okay, and I think a good question. I think what Will has found to some extent is, there's a lot in the fire code to cover this. And what Will is looking for is
Yes.
what
Yeah.
might sneak through there. And like she said, decommissioning requirements seem to be one thing that maybe we need to write our own set for. And that's the bottom line is what still needs to be covered. And that's what Will was trying to figure out.
So, Bill, if a bunch of jobs would normally go to the code officer unless they've exceeded some maximum, but you want all the jobs to go to the site plan review, but doesn't that require a separate law? Because if they never have to go to the site plan review by virtue, it wasn't triggered by the size of the installation or something.
The way, I mean, if one wanted to, the way you capture, I mean, because the site plan review law, one of the criterion is more than 1 acre of disturbance, but there's about 20 criteria. And so one could simply be any battery energy storage facility exceeding X kilowatt hours. And then that would just capture it. Again, there's a whole set of things. But I also agree with Catherine, we have to fix everything. We can't do the fact that there's this or that of the other agencies involved is just the way it is. And we're just trying to fix a few of the gaping holes to some extent. Because this stuff gets really technical. And face it, we're Caroline, we're a little town. We just don't have the technical expertise to handle a lot of this stuff. And we're gonna have to rely on the fact that hopefully someone somewhere, but to Will's point, for example, she had written me a note saying, okay, so there's a fire, they're going to throw a bunch of water on it. If you're in an urban area, that goes to a sewer system that goes to a water treatment plant. Here, that flows into a creek that, the road ditch that goes to a stream that goes into Cuba Lake or whatever. And so I don't know what we can do about that, but the code seems to be written expecting not a rural area.
Well, but that would, to me, would imply that there's some assessment of appropriateness for certain projects then given the infrastructure that you have. Like that would be like the EPA shouldn't be, whatever the jurisdiction is, wouldn't allow a project where you couldn't mitigate an emergency, right? I mean, that to me is like, well, we're not going to have, if that's the case, that we couldn't safely deal with an emergency, then the town should be saying, we don't have any of these facilities at all because we don't have the infrastructure to deal with an emergency. I mean,
Possible. I guess where I was going.
I don't know the answer, but.
Right. No, because, a possible answer would be, oh, then you have to have a containment structure so that the runoff from putting out the fire goes into this confined drainage area that you've made. Is that a good solution? I don't know, but it's a possible way to mitigate it. But I don't want to have to worry about every possible emergency situation, have us figure out what the answer is, right?
That's where I'm going with this too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, so I don't know anything about battery storage facilities. Like, are they common at all? Are they common in rural areas? What do we know about, like, I'm going to stay out of it, but I guess I just,
They're too new.
that we're getting, like, I don't even know what we're talking about.
Right. Okay, so one thing that would be helpful to know is that the technology is new. You're not going to hear anything from EPA for several years because they don't have data. So the way the fire code is written allows for new technologies and having certain kinds of testing done. And they talk about getting people, the appropriate experts, to analyze the results of the fire tests and agree, approve of the results. It's all new, and not only is it new, it's changing really fast. They've just created so many new combinations of metals and non-metals in salts to use that they don't know yet what they've got, essentially.
You are ahead of the curve, Will.
Yeah. So the question is, what can or should Caroline do about that, right? Because that is always going to be the case, that there's a new battery technology out there that probably regulations haven't caught up to yet.
Yes.
I think also to the point is how likely, I think we all feel there is some chance that there will be distributed battery storage sprinkled over upstate New York, because that's sort of, and Will, you're the electrical engineer person here, but I think that that's probably beneficial to the grid operation if there's, available storage scattered throughout the grid. Is that correct?
It makes your wind and solar energy more efficient because you can control how it is released to the grid, which also means that whoever builds the solar can make better money off of them because they can time the release. So they're really pushing in the industry to combine batteries with solar and wind.
Okay. So it is moderately likely, this is a question, so it is moderately likely that in the next 5 or 10 years that rural locations like Caroline could see the desire to establish a significant battery energy storage facility. Do you think that's true? Will, that's a question to you and everyone
yes,
else.
And yeah, it's moderately likely, and it's for distribution systems, it's huge because it will help control the power quality and help control being able to use the way the distribution is designed now to accommodate having all this other distributed generation there. It's really a big deal. I have to plug in my computer.
All right. So what I'm getting a sense of so far, and as always, the devil is, I don't know what I don't know, but it sounds like we're going to have to, unfortunately, just basically rely on fire code and fire professionals to do their thing, because we can't possibly anticipate, nor if we wrote something in the law, would it be valid for more than a few years because of how technology is changing. But that we should perhaps do a couple things at least. One is, already we had language in the site plan, in our solar law, but similar language in the battery law, saying that basically chemicals needed to put out the fire need to be available on site. That we are thinking of having, I think John's point, to make sure that there is indeed at least one alternate access route. And we want to have something maybe about containment of both the materials from the fire, but the material to put out the fire. There must be some effort at containment of that, and something on decommissioning. And those are the things that have come up so far tonight that might be reasonable to have some sort of provision in a law or the site plan law.
And
That was pretty much the end of my spiel.
and
then the
water
question was, what else?
supply.
Oh, that's
You should
right,
have
water
a-
supply.
Yeah, like a water tank, whatever
Okay.
they're called,
Well, there could
storing
be
water.
there could be a water tank, or there could be a pond, right? Now, of course, ponds are variable, but that's why farmers always had their stock pond, right? So they had water available to take care of the cattle.
Right.
Okay, so for me then, and maybe this requires looking at the document you put out already, Will, is to say, okay, so what else? Are there any other main, in the zoom out mode, other main general concerns that we might want to try to address for the town? I am now starring the things we just.
Oh, yeah, there's the thing of the town gets to decide what a public utility is.
Well,
Or what it means to have an exclusive control by a public utility, because that determines who has to follow the fire code.
So let's say the town doesn't speak to that point, because frankly, I think we're not going to. Is there a default? I mean, like if the town didn't have something, if our code officer, we have nothing on the books. Are you saying the code officer is supposed to, again, that's the, I can't remember the language as, the appropriate authority, but does that mean the code officer is supposed to make a determination at some point on that? Is that what you're saying, Will?
That would be a question for the code officer, because if you don't fall under you have to fall under some provision, but what the people who wrote the fire code would be assuming that if you're under the exclusive control of a public utility, then you're subject to some other code. But if you go to that code, it may be written in a way that doesn't include you. You could have a company that's owned by a public utility, owned by the same parent as a public utility, but they're making an installation under a different set of rules. They're a different entity, and they're a different type of entity. That's, and that's like really involved.
Yeah, I think we can.
I don't know, maybe, I don't know who you would even ask. You could go back to these same guys and say, well, where do they go? And then look and see what the definition is for who that other code applies to. I don't think they contemplated what it means to have distributed generation. I think that's the thing.
Yeah, so maybe the state will catch up with that at some point. I think that we probably can't touch that all that much. Our code officer is not going to determine whether they're a public utility or not in the category. I just don't see that happening. So here's what I do suggest. I think that if it's a building, then the aesthetics of the building design are covered by the site plan review law, and that's what it's for. It's got that, and we may want to, but that's only, again, if they exceed a 1 acre threshold. So we can decide if we want to say, there's probably no reason to treat the actual aesthetics of the building for a battery energy storage any differently than any other building. So only if they become big enough to have a few buildings do we have something to say about building design. But in terms of building, in terms of aesthetics, but in terms of any other safety stuff, I mean, as long as they conform with fire code, that's probably appropriate. And we're going to add these pieces that we said, and I will look through what you had put out also to see if there's anything else that catches my eye. Everyone should look through the documents that we'll put out saying, here's things we had talked about and it's not covered by code that I can see, and decide if we want to write something about that. But it seems to me there might be room for a small law that says, in addition to what site plan says or does, about battery energy storage facilities, these other things must be addressed if there's a proposal to store, to have a battery energy storage facility in Caroline. That's kind of where I've come down to, I think, at this point. What other people think? Hearing
That sounds
deafening
reasonable
silence.
to me.
Okay.
Like, we don't have to choose one or the other, absolutely. And let the site plan law take over what is going to flow well and make sure that nothing's slipping through the cracks by having a separate law.
Well, I think, is it possible that, again, a battery energy storage facility could take up a couple acres if what they're doing, I mean, if what they're doing is building a couple buildings, or because they are building, putting a whole bunch of like railroad box containers out there? Any sense of how often they are more than just a single building structure? Or no one knows yet?
That would be
because
huge.
What would be huge?
That would be, yeah, that would be a lot of power. Then they'd have to move that power on transmission lines.
Of which we don't have adequate probably capacity in Caroline.
No, I don't think you do. Not even with what they've already rebuilt.
So what it's sounding like is it's more likely that we're going to at most get a building as opposed to a couple acres of container storage.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I think mostly it's going to get uncovered, because unless they're going to disturb an acre of land, it's just not going to get looked at. And there's, again, I have no particular reason outside the safety things, which we're going to put down, why we get to say something about the aesthetics of a battery energy storage building if we don't say the same thing about some other commercial building that happens to disturb only a half acre of land.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions people want to raise, or other, few topics to discuss that you want a little feedback on, Will? But I think we all need to go back over, again, what you sent, because the rest of you only saw it this afternoon. I know it was more background for the meeting to use during the meeting. But I want to use our convening time if someone up.
I just put just an article in the chat about.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will try to take a look at that. Okay, so yeah, this is hard. Okay, this when we're dealing with a technical topic, and we're just not set up to really do that, right? We just don't have the staff or the expertise. So this is really hard. So I think where we'll go from here, as a suggestion, I'm looking for feedback, is, Will, if there's anything you're still tracking down, finish tracking it down. All of us will look at the topics that you already sent out to see what else we might want to put into a law, but it basically it's like safety and public health sort of concerns. And
so I'd like to say that when you're looking over those notes, and I realize that they're pretty dense, but there might be a specific topic you feel more comfortable with or you're more interested in. I didn't provide all the information, but I provided the part of the code to look at, and the easiest place to read that is in the NYSERDA guide for local governments. Do you know which guide I mean? I think we might have put it in Google Docs already. If we didn't, we should. And it's real easy to just do a find in that document and go to that section, and you can read it. And it's actually pretty well written. They did a really good job in writing this. It's not as garbled as most of the fire code.
all right. So Will, when the guy from the state wrote you back on the fire code stuff, he referenced a publication. Is that the same publication? You referenced, okay, so that we do have that, because I think I put that on the email.
Yes.
And I'll make sure it gets into the Google Doc.
I'm pretty sure it is. Yep.
Okay.
I'll just double check, but yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Catherine, Jonathan, do you guys have any other points, for the planning board, not necessarily on the battery stuff, anything else that you want to bring up for the planning board? And then I think I'm going to see if Leo wants to say anything, since he missed the beginning of the meeting. But first, just want to see if you guys had any other topics or issues you wanted to bring up. Okay. Okay, and I do know, that the planning board, whatever, zoning commission has met a couple times. I don't know anything about what is going on there particularly. I think they're learning, getting the basics down of how one goes about the process and everything. Leo, I see that you joined us. Thank you. We have a few extra minutes. If you wanted to talk to us, I will give you 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
1 second, let me push the right buttons here. Yeah, I'm really appreciating the work you folks are doing. You have, just in the part that I listened into, raised many of the points that I would have raised if I'd gotten here at the beginning. I think it's very good to look at where the general zoning law covers these and what's special in particular about battery facilities. In particular, the decommissioning, I think, is one thing that makes them particularly unique, because depending on where we are in 10 or 20 years with battery recycling, it could be either a valuable resource or it could be something very hard to get rid of. We don't know. But the other things, I'm all for keeping the law simple not had a lot of overlapping or unnecessary procedures when the general regulation could cover it. So anyway, you guys are doing great work.
Okay, great. Thank you for those thoughts. That's great. Okay, so I think we'll just call it quits there, unless somebody else again has anything else they want to bring up or discuss right now. Okay, great. Yeah, again, not easy stuff to work through. So I think we made actually in some ways more progress than I hope we might make tonight. So that's good. That's great. Okay, get out there. I know this weekend it may actually be dry enough to do a little more gardening. So, Will, you're
That's right.
When do you want to meet again?
Okay, we'll do our normal
The next meeting?
Yeah, it'll be the second Thursday of May.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
great.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you for all your work.
Okay.
Bye.